Hey AP Langers, I'm Dr. Clark, and this video is all about how to write the argument essay on the AP Language and Composition test. Now, the argument essay is the third question on the AP test, and this is when you finally get an opportunity to make an argument, to take a position, and to make that argument completely out of information from your own head. With the new AP Language and Composition exam, the College Board has adopted a stable prompt wording. So you know that the argument essay prompt is going to say, write an essay that argues your position on some literary or rhetorical concept or idea. Past topics have included topics like things that are overrated, the value of exploring the unknown, the skill of artifice in politics and consumer culture, the value of disobedience in promoting human progress, topics like that, things that have to do with literary or rhetorical concepts. So as you can see, topics are fairly broad, and they're open to discussions including a wide range of different perspectives and a wide range of different examples that you can use to support your position. As long as you're a generally educated and informed person, you should have some ideas to share about the topic, whatever it turns out to be. Like all three of the essays on the AP Language and Composition test, the College Board uses the 6-point rubric in order to score your essays. So there's 1 point for the thesis, 4 points for evidence and commentary, and then 1 point for sophistication. So let's start with the thesis. Now, the key to earning the point for the thesis statement is to write a thesis that presents a defensible position about the topic. Now, be sure you make an argument here. Don't just discuss the topic in a general way. Find an aspect of it that is somewhat controversial or up for debate, and take a position on it. Also, don't equivocate. Remember, this is an argument essay, so it's not a good time to say, well, there are good arguments on both sides. Sometimes that's a good strategy, but not in an argument essay. Be sure to write a thesis that responds directly to the topic identified in the prompt. There is a line in the rubric that says there is a thesis, but it does not respond to the prompt. And keep in mind, you'll lose the point for the thesis statement no matter how good or interesting it is if it doesn't directly relate to the topic identified in the prompt. Before we get any further, quick warning about tone and style. On page 88 of the AP Lang and Comp course description, it says, develop the habit of thinking about argument as a way to participate in a conversation of an unresolved question, instead of engaging the issue as an adversary. So what do they mean, don't be an adversary? What they mean is don't rant or rave. Don't engage in ad hominem or personal attacks against those who might disagree with you. Consider yourself to be addressing an open-minded and academically oriented audience who's willing to listen to an informed opinion. Now, once you've laid out your thesis statement, it's essential that you establish at least 2 and as many as 4 supporting claims. Keep in mind that an argument with only 1 supporting claim is not going to be sufficient on the argument essay. So you want to establish a clear and coherent line of reasoning. Your claims should build toward a coherent message. They should all work together to create an argument that flows and that's interconnected logically. The best way to make sure you're doing that is to explain the progression between the claims. In other words, use strong transitions that establish a logical line of reasoning. Your transitions should show the relationship between paragraphs and arguments, show how they build on each other, show how they relate to each other. That's the easiest way to make sure that you're developing a coherent line of reasoning. So the next step on the rubric is evidence. And unlike the synthesis essay, in the argument essay, the evidence is not provided for you. There's not going to be any evidence in the packet at all. In fact, all it's going to be is a prompt. It's just going to introduce some sort of literary or rhetorical concept, and then it's going to ask you to take a position on it. And so all of that is going to have to come from inside your own head. You have to provide specific evidence to support every claim you make within your line of reasoning. So when a lot of students think about evidence, the first thing they think of is facts and statistics. And obviously, facts and statistics are great sources of evidence for an argument essay. The problem is they're sometimes hard to remember. And keep in mind, you can't do any research during the writing of the argument. And so if you really don't have those facts and statistics just sort of bouncing off the top of your head, there are 6 sources of evidence that I recommend students think about when writing an argument essay. So the first category of evidence is historical examples. Now, examples from history work great on the argument essay on the AP test. So let's think about our prompt. Now, immediately, when I think about logic versus emotion, I think about the JFK-Nixon debate. It was the first ever televised presidential debate, and we learned some interesting things from that. People had a very emotional reaction to the very youthful and idealistic JFK, compared to the more cerebral and intellectual Nixon, and it made a big difference in how they viewed the election. So now I can use that as an example that illustrates the point that I want to make about the prompt. So the second source of evidence that I recommend you think about is contemporary events. If you can use examples from history, you should also be able to think about some examples from the present day. So we could talk about the JFK-Nixon debates. We could also talk about the debates between President Trump and Hillary Clinton, or the debates between President Trump and Biden. And we could evaluate how logic and emotion played into those presidential debates as a way of illustrating our point about how logic and how emotion works rhetorically. Now, the third source of evidence that I recommend you think about is personal experience. Now look, this is not a personal narrative. I don't want this to turn into your life story, but you can use very specific examples from your own life in order to illustrate your argument. You want to use a specific example from your own life in order to illustrate your point, and then you want to show a clear connection. So maybe there was a time when you were so emotionally connected to an argument that you weren't able to see the very good arguments on the other side. But then when you calmed down and thought about it logically, you were able to see what the other person was trying to tell you. If you can use an example like that, that's going to work really well for an argument on the AP essay. The fourth source that I recommend you look at is literature. Now, I'm talking about literature broadly. Yes, we should look at classic literature. For sure, use Huckleberry Finn, use The Great Gatsby. For sure, use Of Mice and Men, or whatever great works of literature that you're reading in your English classes. But don't neglect to include some sources of popular fiction as well. At this point, most English teachers are just going to be really happy to hear that you're reading. And so whatever books you're reading, whatever you like, whether it's Percy Jackson or Harry Potter or The Hunger Games or The Maze Runner, don't discount those as possible sources of evidence for the argument essay. So right away, when I'm thinking about our hypothetical topic of logic versus emotion, I'm thinking about the book Huckleberry Finn, and I'm thinking about how powerful that book was and how it really made a difference in the way that people thought about post-bellum America, and they thought about racism in the post-slavery era. And so here's Mark Twain, right? He's using humor, he's creating these very interesting characters that draw you in, and he's changing the way you think about the issue based on his use of emotion. Boy, Huckleberry Finn would be a great example from literature that I could use. So the fifth source of evidence that I want you to consider is academic texts. For example, maybe in your psychology class you read a really interesting academic text about manipulation and how manipulation works. Now, manipulation is persuasion with the intent to trick or fool the audience in a way that doesn't actually benefit them. And you could talk about that concept that you read about in your psychology class and use it as an example of why maybe we should prefer logic over emotion. So you see what I'm doing? I'm taking that specific text that I read in a completely different class, and I'm connecting it directly to the topic that I'm writing about. So the last category that I'm going to recommend to you is the most difficult for some students, but if you're a really good writer, it can also be the most fun, and that is theory, or academic concept. In other words, not even necessarily a text that you've read, but an academic theory that you're familiar with. So for example, maybe you've studied Stephen Toulmin's model of argumentation, which talks about claim, evidence, warrant, and all the different parts that go into a really persuasive argument. And Toulmin seems to be in favor of the logic side of the debate. So again, if I was going to write my paper in favor of logic, maybe I'd use Stephen Toulmin as an example of how a really good logical argument is constructed and how airtight and effective it can be. So once you have some really good evidence and examples ready to go, don't forget about your commentary. It's not enough just to provide evidence and examples. You have to show how that evidence supports your thesis. In the commentary, you want to explain the relationship between the evidence and your thesis, and you want to do this at every level of your argument. Every one of your subclaims should have a specific piece of evidence that is directly connected back to the thesis explicitly. So the sixth point on the AP rubric is for sophistication, or what we sometimes call complexity. In order to demonstrate sophistication, you need to demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. You want to make sure that you craft a nuanced argument. Explore the complexities or tensions within the topic. Don't avoid them. A lot of students instinctively don't want to address the really controversial or really complicated or really difficult aspects of the topic. And that's the exact wrong instinct. If you're going to get that sophistication and complexity point, you need to go after those tensions. You need to point out the points at which the argument breaks down, the limits of what you're able to prove within that argument. Another aspect of sophistication is exploring the implications of your argument. What's the broader context of the argument you're making? What's implied by your argument that you can make more clear or explicit? Why does your argument matter? Why is it important? These are all things that are going to be essential if you're going to earn that last point. Now, I know a lot of you are worried about grammar and punctuation, and here's the thing. I do want you to be as clean as possible. Try not to make mistakes. Edit as you go. But don't go back at the end and spend a lot of time crossing your T's and dotting your I's. It's simply not worth it. Now, if the problems with grammar and mechanics interfere with your ability to communicate your ideas, then it will affect your score. But it's scored as a rough draft, so don't spend too much time editing. Remember that you've got 2 hours to write 3 essays, so every minute counts. Write as cleanly and clearly as possible the first time, edit as you go, and then move on. Now, the conclusion is an important part of the essay, but I don't want you to spend too much time on it. A conclusion really should just be 1 or 2 sentences long. It should restate the thesis in different words, and then it should end with some kind of a nice mic drop moment. Bring your essay to a satisfying conclusion, and that's going to leave the reader with the sense that you're a good writer, that you're an effective writer, and that they should give you a good score. So those are the basics of writing the argument essay for the AP Language and Composition test. Check out our other videos that describe how to write the synthesis essay and the analysis essay. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Clark.